What if the system was rigged against you from the start? What if no matter how talented you were, they refused to see you? But then, what if you forced them to listen? Before we dive into this powerful story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support keeps us going and allows us to create more inspiring content just like this. Little Rock, Arkansas, a city carrying echoes of a past that many preferred to forget. On the surface, things had changed. The segregation laws were long gone. The schools integrated, and yet, beneath the polished exterior, the same old prejudices lingered. At Westwood High, an institution known for its academic prestige, the illusion of equality was carefully maintained. Students of color were allowed in, but they were never truly included. Inside its grand hallways, where lockers gleamed under fluorescent lights and banners boasted championship titles, there was an unspoken rule: some students belonged here more than others. Jordan Carter had learned this rule the hard way. 16 years old, sharp-minded, and observant, he had long understood that his presence in this school was tolerated, not welcomed. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't loud. He followed the rules. And yet, he might as well have been invisible. He saw it every day. The way teachers engaged with the white students, encouraging them, praising their ideas, inviting them to participate in academic competitions and leadership programs. Meanwhile, students like him were expected to sit back and stay quiet. It didn't matter how many times he raised his hand. It didn't matter that he turned in assignments on time or that his answers were always right. Jordan had lost count of the number of times he had seen a white student give an incorrect answer and receive nothing but a warm smile. "That's okay. Try again," the teachers would say, their voices filled with patience. But when he made the smallest mistake, the classroom would fall into silence. That heavy kind of silence. The one that carried judgment. The one that said, "See, he's not as smart as he thinks he is." It wasn't just the teachers. The students knew their place. 2. Brandon Wright, for example, the son of a prominent businessman, never missed an opportunity to remind Jordan of where he stood. Brandon had the kind of confidence that only came with privilege, an unshaken belief that he was untouchable. "You're overthinking it," he'd smirk whenever Jordan tried to point out the obvious bias. "You act like there's some grand conspiracy against you." But Jordan didn't need to act like anything. He lived it, and yet, none of it compared to what happened in history class that day. It started like any other lesson. The smell of old textbooks lingered in the air as students flipped through pages half-heartedly, waiting for the bell to ring. At the front of the class, Mrs. Reynolds, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, lectured about the Civil War. Her tone was clipped, her words precise, and as always, her attention was focused on the students she deemed worthy. "So, can anyone tell me the significance of Sherman's March to the Sea?" she asked. Scanning the room, Brandon spoke first. Wasn't it about destroying the South's economy?" Mrs. Reynolds smiled. "That's not entirely wrong. It was meant to break the Confederacy's will. But let's think deeper." Jordan had heard enough. He knew the answer. He had studied this topic inside and out, read accounts from historians, analyzed strategies. His hand went up instinctively. For a second, it seemed like Mrs. Reynolds didn't see him. She turned her gaze elsewhere, looking at students who sat in silence. Only when no one else spoke did she finally sigh, her lips pressing together in thin disapproval. "Yes, Jordan?" Jordan kept his voice steady. Sherman's march was part of a strategy called total war. The goal wasn't just to defeat the Confederate Army, but to destroy their resources, to cripple their ability to keep fighting. They burned crops, destroyed railroads, took supplies, anything that could give the South an advantage. A pause. The answer was correct, completely, undeniably correct. Mrs. Reynolds tilted her head slightly, examining him like he was some kind of anomaly. "And who taught you that?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge that wasn't there before. Jordan frowned. "I read it in several sources." That's interesting," she interrupted, her expression unreadable. Then, she let out a small chuckle. "Not everyone can understand history that well." The room shifted. The energy changed. Jordan could feel it. The amusement in the air. The quiet snickers from the back of the room. The way a few students exchanged knowing looks. Mrs. Reynolds hadn't outright dismissed him. But she didn't have to. Her words had done enough. They had turned his intelligence into something unexpected. Something unusual. Not everyone could understand history that well. The message was clear. You're not supposed to be this smart. You're not supposed to know more than the students I favor. Jordan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. He had been ignored, talked over, dismissed. But this time, there was something different about it. This time, he felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest, heavier than ever before. For the rest of the class, he stayed silent, but in his mind, a thought repeated itself, over and over again. How long am I supposed to keep my head down? He had spent years letting these moments pass, pretending they didn't bother him. He had told himself that as long as he worked hard, as long as he kept proving himself, things would change. But they hadn't. And for the first time, Jordan wondered if they ever would. The bell rang, and students began packing up their things. As he slipped his notebook into his bag, he heard Brandon's voice from behind him. Tough break, Carter, he said, smirking. Guess some people just don't know how to take a compliment. Jordan didn't answer. He didn't need to, because while Brandon laughed, while the other students filed out of the room, while Mrs. Reynolds went back to her desk as if nothing had happened, Jordan sat there, staring at his desk, knowing that something had shifted inside him. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew that this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. Mrs. Reynolds was more than just a history teacher. She was a pillar of Westwood High, a woman who had spent decades shaping the school's culture. Her reputation was built on discipline, on tradition, on keeping things exactly as they had always been. She prided herself on molding young minds, but only the ones she believed were worth her effort. To her, intelligence had a certain look, a certain background. Students like Jordan, the ones who didn't come from old money, the ones whose ancestors had been left out of history books, were nothing more than outliers, exceptions at best, but never equals. And in her eyes, Jordan had stepped out of line. The moment he had answered her question so flawlessly, something in her demeanor had changed. She had masked it well, smiling as if amused, but Jordan had caught the flicker in her eyes. He had seen it before. The way certain teachers would tense up when a student like him showed ability beyond what they expected. She wasn't about to let that stand. The classroom was still settling after the exchange. Some students whispered among themselves. Others scrolled idly on their phones, waiting for the period to end. But Mrs. Reynolds wasn't done yet. She flipped through her gradebook, as if contemplating something important, before finally glancing up with a thoughtful expression. Jordan, she said, her voice smooth, almost pleasant, you seem to have a deep understanding of history. That's admirable, but you know, true intellect isn't just about theory, it's about demonstrating what you've learned in practice. Jordan didn't respond. He didn't like where this was going. Mrs. Reynolds let her gaze drift to the class. Let's test that theory, shall we? The students quieted. A few leaned forward, sensing something interesting about to unfold. She tapped her pen against the desk. I recall reading something about your grandfather. Didn't he play jazz? Jordan's fingers curled into his palm. Music is such a fascinating part of history. She continued. It tells the stories of people, of struggle, of triumph. I think it would be a wonderful learning experience if you could share something with us. She smiled, tilting her head ever so slightly. Why don't you play something for the class? A beat passed. Then, laughter. Not outright mocking. Not yet, but the kind of laughter that carried expectation. The kind that hinted at an inside joke Jordan wasn't in on. Except he was. Brandon chuckled from his seat near the back, crossing his arms lazily. So, you're a secret musician? Guess we're about to find out if it runs in the family. Tyler, sitting beside Jordan, tensed, his voice barely above a whisper. He muttered, you don't have to do this. Jordan didn't respond, because he understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a request. This wasn't about appreciating music or celebrating his grandfather's legacy. This was a trap. If he refused, Mrs. Reynolds would twist it into a lesson about humility, about how knowledge wasn't the same as talent. She'd let the class snicker at how he had backed down, how he wasn't as impressive as he seemed. If he accepted but faltered, even for a moment, she would have exactly what she wanted. His hesitation would be proof that he had overstepped, that he had thought too highly of himself, that no matter how smart he was, no matter how much he studied, he would never truly belong. This wasn't about music. This was about putting him back in his place. Jordan's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken challenge in Brandon's smirk, the barely contained amusement in Mrs. Reynolds' eyes. And for a moment, a small part of him considered walking away. He had spent years keeping his head down, letting things slide. He had seen his mother bite her tongue in the face of condescension, heard his grandfather's stories of being turned away from opportunities because of the color of his skin. You have to be twice as good to get half as much, his grandfather had told him once. Jordan had never forgotten that. He could stay silent now. Let them win. Let them believe what they wanted. Or he could do something else. He inhaled slowly, then lifted his gaze. "All right," he said, "I'll play." The room went still. For a second, even Mrs. Reynolds seemed surprised. But then, a slow, satisfied smile crossed her lips. "Good," she said. "We'll all be looking forward to it." The class erupted into whispers, some murmuring in excitement, others exchanging knowing glances. No one had expected him to agree. Brandon laughed under his breath. "This ought to be good." Tyler shook his head slightly, concern evident in his expression. "Are you sure about this?" Jordan didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew. This wasn't just a performance. This was something bigger, and no matter what they were expecting, they weren't ready for what he was about to do. By the next morning, the entire school was buzzing with whispers about Jordan's upcoming performance. The rumor had spread faster than he had expected, and now it seemed like everyone had an opinion on how it would go. Most of them weren't in his favor. In the crowded hallways of Westwood High, students exchanged knowing glances and hushed laughter. Some were simply curious, wondering if Jordan had some hidden talent. Others, like Brandon and his circle, were already treating it as entertainment. "I bet he won't even make it through the first few notes," someone muttered as Jordan walked past. "Nah, he'll probably chicken out before he even touches the keys," another voice added. Brandon, standing with his usual group near the lockers, smirked. "Either way, it's gonna be fun to watch." Jordan ignored them, keeping his expression neutral. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave them more power. But inside, his heart pounded. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was something deeper. Something that had been building for years. Near the stairwell, Tyler was waiting for him. Unlike the others, his face wasn't amused. It was tense, concerned. He didn't waste time, pulling Jordan aside into a quieter corner. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low. Jordan met his eyes. "I know." Tyler sighed. "Then why are you?" Jordan hesitated for a moment, then looked down at his hands. "Because if I don't, they'll think they were right about me." Tyler shook his head. "You know this isn't about talent, right? It's not about music. It's about making sure you know your place. They don't want to see you succeed, Jordan. They just want to see you fail." Jordan let out a small, humorless laugh. "Then I guess I'll have to disappoint them." Tyler frowned. "I don't want to see you humiliated." Jordan smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Do you think I'd let that happen?" Tyler didn't answer. He just sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "Just be careful, all right?" Jordan gave a small nod before walking past him toward class. From a distance, Mrs. Reynolds watched the exchange. She had seen students like Jordan before. The ones who thought they could rise above their place. The ones who believed that talent alone could break down barriers that had been standing for generations. It never worked. She had made sure of that. This wasn't just about putting a student in his place. It was about maintaining order. Jordan had stepped out of line. And today, in front of everyone, he would be reminded why he didn't belong. The plan was simple. Jordan would sit at that piano and fail. The students would laugh. And by the time it was over, the unspoken rules of Westwood High would be stronger than ever. The classroom was already half full when Jordan arrived. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere the moment he stepped through the door. Eyes turned toward him, conversations quieted, replaced by expectant grins and barely concealed amusement. It felt like walking into an arena. Brandon was lounging in his seat near the back. looking relaxed, as if he were settling in for a show. Madison, the quiet girl who never involved herself in the school's social politics, was watching with a neutral expression. But there was something in her eyes, something almost like curiosity. Tyler had taken his usual seat, but he wasn't looking at Jordan. His hands were clenched on his desk, and his jaw was tight. At the front of the class, Mrs. Reynolds stood near her desk, a picture of calm authority. "Well," she said smoothly, "it looks like everyone is eager to see this. Jordan, whenever you're ready." The way she said it, so polite, so professional, it was almost enough to make someone think this was a genuine opportunity. But Jordan knew better. He nodded once and walked toward the piano. And the moment he saw it, he understood just how deep the trap had been set. The piano was a wreck. It had clearly been neglected for years. Dust covered its surface. Some of the keys were chipped, and a few didn't look like they would play at all. The class broke into laughter. "Wow," someone said, barely containing their amusement. "That thing looks older than his grandpa." Brandon grinned, shaking his head. "Damn, I almost feel bad for the guy." Almost. Mrs. Reynolds gave a small, patient smile. "If it's too difficult, Jordan, you're free to change your mind." Jordan ran his fingers lightly over the keys. They felt rough, uneven. He could already tell some of them wouldn't respond properly. He could walk away. He could refuse. But he didn't. Instead, he sat down, positioning himself in front of the instrument. And then, to the surprise of everyone in the room, he smiled. The air in the classroom was thick with anticipation. Every eye was locked on Jordan, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for him to fumble, to freeze, to give them the spectacle they had been promised. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Still, he hadn't played a single note. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing moment. Then, from somewhere in the back, a student snickered. "I knew it. He was bluffing all along." The laughter spread, cautious at first, then more confident as others joined in. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the walls, wrapping around Jordan like a challenge. He didn't react. He simply let his fingers hover over the keys, his mind tuning out the noise, the murmurs, the weight of 100 expectations pressing down on him. And then, he played. Not a grand, flashy opening, not the rushed, nervous hammering of a student trying to prove himself. Just one note, low, deep, a single, weighted sound that hung in the air long after his fingers had left the key. It wasn't the kind of note people expected. It wasn't a bright, cheerful melody or a dramatic opening meant to impress. It was something different, something heavier. Jordan pressed another key, then another. Slowly, deliberately, he let the sound build. A blues rhythm, slow and rich, began to take shape, curling through the room like a memory long forgotten. The laughter faded, bit by bit. It was swallowed by the music, replaced by something else. Confusion, then curiosity, then something deeper, something unspoken. It was a song that didn't belong to the pristine halls of Westwood High. It was raw, full of history, full of the stories people like Mrs. Reynolds didn't talk about. It was a song of resilience. Jordan felt his fingers move instinctively, as if guided by something older than himself. He wasn't just playing, he was speaking through the keys. He saw his grandfather's hands in his mind, strong hands, worn by years of work. The same hands that once danced over ivory keys in a dim-lit club where no white audience would ever go. He saw the tired eyes of the men who played before him, their music echoing through streets that never let them belong. The classroom, once filled with mocking laughter, was silent now. Even Brandon had stopped smirking, his expression unreadable. Madison, who had barely spoken a word all year, had placed a hand over her chest, her fingers curled slightly, as if clutching something unseen. And Mrs. Reynolds, her posture had shifted. She was still standing, still composed, but there was something different in the way she watched. Something cautious, something unsettled. She had expected a disaster. She had expected Jordan to fail. But this was not what she had planned. And it wasn't over yet. Jordan was just getting started. The room pulsed with an energy no one had expected. Jordan's fingers moved with unwavering confidence, pressing the keys with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the classroom. His music was no longer just a performance. It was something else entirely, a declaration, a defiance, a voice that had been silenced for too long. The melody swelled, climbing higher, each note striking sharp and unyielding. It was a sound that refused to be ignored. Then came the deep, aching lows, notes that carried the weight of years spent being overlooked, dismissed, and treated as if he didn't belong. Jordan felt it all, and he let the piano speak for him. His hands danced over the keys, pulling the class into his world, into a rhythm that had lived in his blood long before he was even born. The blues morphed into something more, something alive. It was no longer just music, it was history, pain, triumph. It was every whispered conversation about injustice, every silent moment of resentment swallowed down because fighting back had never been an option. Until now, for the first time, Jordan wasn't asking to be seen. He was demanding it. The faces around him changed. The students who had laughed minutes before were no longer smirking. Some had their eyes locked on his hands, watching in stunned silence as the music poured out of him. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they had been part of something cruel. Brandon, the boy who had led the mockery, sat stiffly, arms crossed over his chest. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable, but he wasn't laughing anymore. Madison, the quietest girl in class, stared at Jordan with wide eyes. Her lips slightly parted. She seemed mesmerized, caught in something bigger than herself. Something she didn't yet have the words to describe. Even Tyler, Jordan's only friend, who had feared this would all go terribly wrong, sat motionless, as if he were afraid that breathing too loudly might break whatever spell Jordan had cast. But the most striking reaction came from Mrs. Reynolds. She had been so sure, so absolutely certain that Jordan would stumble, that the weight of the room pressing down on him would be too much, that the pressure to perform in front of a crowd waiting for his failure would crack him open like brittle glass. And yet, here he was, rewriting the ending she had planned. Mrs. Reynolds's hand clenched slightly at her side. The slight twitch in her jaw was the only betrayal of her discomfort. She had seen students break before, seen them fold under the weight of expectations they weren't prepared to carry. But Jordan wasn't breaking. If anything, he was becoming something bigger than what she had intended him to be. And that terrified her. Jordan could feel it, the shift in the room, the silent reckoning taking place within his classmates. But he didn't slow down. He didn't ease up, because this wasn't just for him anymore. He could hear his grandfather's voice in the back of his mind. Words spoken late at night over the hum of an old record player. Music ain't just sound, boy. It's proof you're here, proof you matter. And in that moment, Jordan understood. He wasn't playing to impress anyone. He wasn't playing for their approval. He was playing to remind them that he existed. The final chord rang out, reverberating through the room, hanging heavy in the charged silence that followed. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, from the back of the classroom, a single clap broke the stillness. Another followed, then another, and then, all at once, the entire room erupted in applause. Mrs. Reynolds stood frozen at her desk. The air in the classroom still crackled with the last echoes of applause. It was a moment she had not anticipated, a shift in power she had not foreseen. Jordan was supposed to fail. He was supposed to fumble, to stutter, to confirm the unspoken assumption that he was out of place, that he did not belong among the best. Instead, he had done the impossible. He had forced them all to see him. Her fingers tightened around the gradebook she clutched, her knuckles turning white. This is unacceptable, she thought. Across the room, Brandon sat stiffly in his chair, his expression unreadable. A part of him wanted to scoff, to dismiss what had just happened as a fluke. But something held him back. He had expected to revel in Jordan's humiliation, to watch him crumble under pressure. Instead, Jordan had commanded the room in a way that even Brandon himself never had. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Tyler exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing. He had been ready to defend his friend, to intervene if things turned ugly. But Jordan hadn't needed saving. He had taken control of the narrative all on his own. Madison, the quiet girl who usually kept to herself, met Jordan's gaze briefly before looking away, as if processing something new. She had never thought much about him before, not beyond what everyone else saw. But now, she wasn't so sure. Mrs. Reynolds cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "All right, class. That's enough. This isn't a concert hall," she said, her voice sharp. "Let's get back to the lesson." But the words felt hollow. They carried none of the authority she was used to wielding. The class wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't mocking Jordan, weren't looking at him as an outsider. They were seeing him, and Mrs. Reynolds hated it. Jordan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He met her gaze, steady and unyielding, and for the first time, she was the one shifting uncomfortably under the weight of silence. There was no arrogance in his expression, no smugness, just quiet certainty. He had won. Outside the classroom, word spread fast. By lunchtime, the entire school was buzzing with talk of what had happened. "Did you hear about Carter?" "Yeah, I thought he was gonna choke. But, man, that was insane. I didn't even know he could play." "I don't know, maybe we've had him figured wrong." Brandon overheard the whispers and clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Mrs. Reynolds refused to let the moment define her. After class, she stormed into the faculty lounge, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. A few teachers glanced up as she entered, their conversations dying mid-sentence. "I need to talk about Jordan Carter," she announced, her voice tight. Across the room, Mr. Langley, the history teacher, raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" Mrs. Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "There's been an overreaction to his performance today. I fear the students are getting the wrong impression." Mr. Langley leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "The wrong impression? He's being elevated beyond his abilities." She continued, "We need to ensure that this doesn't disrupt the structure we have in place." The room was silent. A few teachers exchanged glances. Everyone knew what she meant. A few years ago, her words would have gone unchallenged. But things were changing. Not everyone was so willing to turn a blind eye anymore. Mr. Langley tapped his fingers against his desk, considering her carefully. "From what I heard, Jordan didn't ask for anything. He just played." Mrs. Reynolds tightened her lips. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" For the first time in years, she had no answer. Meanwhile, Jordan wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating. Instead, he sat outside on the bleachers, staring out at the empty field. Deep in thought, Tyler found him there and sat down beside him. "So, what now?" Jordan didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, "This isn't over. They're not going to let this slide." Tyler frowned. "You already proved them wrong. Man, you won." Jordan shook his head. "Winning once isn't enough. Not when the game is rigged." Tyler exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what do you want to do?" Jordan looked down at his hands. The same hands that had played the song that had changed everything. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'm not done." Mrs. Reynolds sat at the faculty meeting, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished wood table. The murmurs of discussion filled the air, but her focus remained on one thing: Jordan Carter. His piano performance had been a disruption, a crack in the carefully maintained order of Westwood High. She had spent years ensuring that students like Jordan remained in the shadows, never challenging the structure that benefited those who belonged. But now, things were shifting. The applause still echoed in her mind, a reminder of how quickly authority could slip through her fingers. She leaned forward, her voice measured yet firm. "We need to address what happened in my classroom." Across from her, Principal Simmons adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "I heard about Carter's performance," he said carefully. "It was unexpected." "Exactly," she replied, "and it's setting a dangerous precedent. The students are getting the wrong idea. They're beginning to believe that." She hesitated, choosing her words with precision. "That anyone can rise above their place if given the chance." A silence fell over the room. A few of the older faculty members nodded in agreement. Others avoided her gaze, unwilling to speak out but not yet ready to challenge her stance. Principal Simmons sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you propose?" She had already prepared her response. "We need to remind the students that talent alone doesn't dictate success. Structure, discipline, and merit do. If Carter is truly exceptional, he should prove it again, under proper evaluation." Simmons leaned back, Considering. Then, slowly, he nodded. Set the parameters. But make sure it's fair. She smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Of course. 3 days later, Jordan walked into history class to find an unusual energy in the room. Conversations hushed as eyes turned to him, and a sense of anticipation filled the air. Mrs. Reynolds stood at the front, a composed expression on her face. Before we begin today's lesson, she announced, I have an exciting opportunity to share. Jordan felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew that tone. As you all know, our school's annual talent competition is coming up, she continued. Given the enthusiasm we witnessed last week, I thought it would be appropriate to extend an invitation to Jordan to participate. A murmur spread through the class. Brandon smirked. You mean put on another show? Jordan ignored him. His gaze locked onto Mrs. Reynolds. There was something calculated in the way she had framed the challenge. Tyler, sitting beside him, shifted uncomfortably. I don't like this, he muttered. Jordan didn't either. Then Mrs. Reynolds added, of course, as with all school competitions, there are certain academic requirements. She walked to her desk, lifting a folder. Students participating must maintain a minimum grade of B+ in their respective art courses. Naturally, I checked Jordan's records, and it seems that, unfortunately, his latest assessments do not meet the criteria. Brandon let out a quiet chuckle. Guess that means he's out. Jordan clenched his jaw. He knew he had been doing well in his elective music course. There was no way his grades had slipped that low, unless they had been altered. Tyler leaned in. They're rigging it. Man, they're shutting you out. Mrs. Reynolds feigned concern. Unless, of course, Jordan wishes to take a placement evaluation to prove his eligibility. A live performance test, judged by a panel of faculty members. Another wave of murmurs swept through the class. Jordan understood what was happening. This wasn't just about proving himself. It was about forcing him to either accept the system's judgment or risk being humiliated again. He looked at Mrs. Reynolds. She was daring him to back down. He took a slow breath. I'll take the evaluation. The room fell silent. Tyler groaned. Man, come on. But Jordan had already made up his mind. He had spent his whole life watching doors close before he even had a chance to step through them. This time, he would kick the door open himself. Mrs. Reynolds gave a polite nod, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her satisfaction. Very well, she said. We'll arrange it for next week. Best of luck, Jordan. The challenge was set. The trap was laid. But Jordan wasn't walking into it unprepared. Jordan sat at his desk, the dim glow of his lamp illuminating the papers spread before him. This wasn't just about playing the piano anymore. It wasn't just about proving himself. It was about tearing down the silent barriers that had been in place long before he ever set foot in Westwood High. He had spent years blending into the background, keeping his head down, ignoring the whispers and the glances that told him he wasn't meant to belong here. But after everything, after they tried to erase his talent with a flick of a pen, after they changed his grades to force him out of the competition, he was done staying quiet. A knock at his window startled him. Tyler's face appeared, pressing against the glass. Jordan opened it, and Tyler climbed through, waving a crumpled paper in his hand. They messed with your scores. Man, I got proof. Jordan snatched the paper, scanning the numbers. His original grades. His real grades. B+ in music. Exactly what he needed to qualify for the competition, until someone had conveniently downgraded them. He let out a slow breath. Where did you get this? Tyler hesitated. Madison. Jordan looked up in surprise. She said she overheard some teachers talking in the office. Said she knew something wasn't right. So she started digging. Tyler gave him a pointed look. Guess you're not as alone as you think. Jordan sat back, absorbing it all. Madison. The quiet girl who had never so much as acknowledged him before, had risked her standing to help him. For the first time in a long while, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The next morning, Jordan walked through the school halls with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't the only one who knew. The rumors had started spreading. Whispers in the cafeteria, glances exchanged in the classrooms. By lunchtime, students were outright asking questions. If Jordan's grades weren't good enough, how come he was the best musician in class? Why was he suddenly failing after his performance? Brandon, sitting with his usual crowd, scoffed loudly. Maybe he cheated on that little show of his. Madison turned in her seat. Really? Is that the best excuse you have? Brandon faltered. He wasn't used to being questioned. The social order was shifting, and he could feel it slipping. But none of that mattered, because the school board had received an anonymous tip. And by the end of the day, Mrs. Reynolds had been summoned for an emergency meeting. The night before the talent competition, Jordan stood in his living room, hands resting on the old piano his grandfather had once played. His mother sat on the couch, watching him. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Jordan shook his head. "I do," she sighed. "You know they won't just let you win." "I'm not trying to win." He looked at her. "I'm trying to be heard." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded, and Jordan sat down, placing his fingers on the keys. He played, not for the judges, not for the school, for every time he had been ignored, for every time his name had been called last, for every kid who had ever been told they didn't belong. The gymnasium was packed, students filled the bleachers, teachers lined the back wall, and at the front, a long table where the judges sat, Mrs. Reynolds among them. She didn't look at Jordan as he walked onto the stage, but he felt her presence, a cold weight pressing down on him. Tyler gave him a thumbs up from the audience. Madison sat beside him, her arms crossed, eyes locked on the judges. Jordan took his seat at the piano. A hush fell over the room. And then, he began. The first note rang out, clear and unwavering. Then another, and another. The melody built, weaving through the air like a story long forgotten. It was bold, unafraid, demanding attention. Somewhere in the crowd, Brandon shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Reynolds' fingers curled slightly, gripping the edge of the table. And Jordan played on. This wasn't just a performance. This was a reckoning. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, every eye locked on the stage. The talent competition had always been a casual event, something most students attended out of obligation rather than excitement. But this year was different. This wasn't just about music. It was about power. Jordan sat backstage, his fingers lightly tapping against his knees, mimicking the rhythms he had practiced over and over. He wasn't nervous about playing. He was nervous about what would come after. Out in the audience, conversations buzzed. "Do you think he'll choke? I heard they tried to keep him from entering. I don't get why this is such a big deal. It's just a school competition." But it wasn't just a school competition. Not anymore. Mrs. Reynolds sat in the front row, her expression unreadable, but Jordan could feel her presence like a weight pressing against his chest. She wasn't going to let him win, not easily. The rules had changed again. Just this morning, the judges now had the final say, making up 70% of the total score. And who were the judges? Every single one of them was a teacher Mrs. Reynolds had influence over. Jordan exhaled slowly. Of course. Tyler nudged his shoulder. "They're stacking the deck, man, but they're scared. That's why they're doing this." Madison, sitting beside them, crossed her arms. "It doesn't matter what they do. If you play like you did before, they won't be able to ignore it." Jordan wished he could believe that. Brandon stepped onto the stage first. His piano piece was technically flawless, every note played with precision, every transition seamless. It was the kind of performance the judges were trained to admire, the kind that upheld the school's long tradition of classical excellence. And when he finished, the room erupted in applause. Jordan caught the way Brandon smirked at him as he took his seat. "Your turn," Brandon said, his voice dripping with amusement. Jordan stood. The moment he stepped onto the stage, the air in the auditorium shifted. He didn't play classical. He didn't play something safe. He played jazz. The first few notes rolled out, smooth and rich, filling every corner of the auditorium with something the school had never truly embraced. It wasn't the rigid structure of Beethoven. It wasn't the predictable melody of Mozart. It was alive, moving, bending, refusing to be confined. It was a direct challenge to everything this school valued. Brandon's smirk faded. Some students glanced at each other, uncertain of how to react. Others, the ones who had never been given a stage, began tapping their feet, nodding along with the rhythm. And then, something unexpected happened. A small clap. then another. And soon, a section of the audience was keeping time with him, caught in the music in a way no classical piece had ever managed. Mrs. Reynolds shifted in her seat, glancing toward the head judge. But the man didn't move. No one dared to interrupt. Jordan played like he had nothing to lose. Like he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. And when he struck the final chord, the sound hanging in the air like the last word of an argument no one could refute. Silence. Then, a slow, hesitant clap. Then another. And then the room erupted. The standing ovation wasn't universal. Not everyone was ready to acknowledge what had just happened. But enough people were standing. Enough people were clapping, that the power in the room shifted. Mrs. Reynolds' lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to the head judge, her voice low. "We can't let this stand." The judge hesitated. The audience was watching. The students were waiting. And for the first time, Mrs. Reynolds realized she wasn't in control anymore. The judges sat behind the long table at the front of the auditorium. Their faces unreadable. The room buzzed with anticipation. The energy thick with something unspoken. Every student, every teacher, every administrator. Everyone knew this was about more than just a competition. Jordan stood off to the side of the stage, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He wasn't nervous. Not anymore. Whatever happened next, he had already won. But the system wasn't going to go down without a fight. The judges exchanged glances, their whispered discussion just out of reach. Mrs. Reynolds leaned in, her voice clipped and controlled. "We can't give him the award," she said. "It would send the wrong message." A few of the judges nodded, hesitant but unwilling to openly disagree. They had spent years reinforcing a system that worked in their favor. Letting Jordan win wasn't just about a trophy, it was about admitting that they had been wrong. One of them, a history teacher, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we can say the performance didn't meet the competition's criteria." Another judge nodded. "Yes, we emphasize classical training. Jazz, it's not in the framework." Mrs. Reynolds allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. That was it. That was the loophole she needed. But then, a voice interrupted. Mr. Davis, the school's only music teacher who hadn't sided with Mrs. Reynolds, stood up. "This isn't just about the competition," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "This is about a student who refused to be ignored. You saw what I saw. That was more than just music. That was a statement." The room fell silent. Students turned in their seats, murmuring amongst themselves. For the first time, someone in power had openly defied Mrs. Reynolds. She stiffened. "Mr. Davis, we have rules." "No," he interrupted, shaking his head. "We have a system designed to reward the same people over and over again. And tonight, that system failed." A pause. Then, Tyler stood. He clapped once. Then again. Madison followed. And then the floodgates opened. The entire auditorium erupted into applause. Not polite claps, not hesitant approval, but something louder, something undeniable. A roar of hands coming together. Students rising from their seats. The walls of the school vibrating with a truth no one could silence. Jordan stood still, letting the moment wash over him. He didn't smile, didn't pump his fist in victory. He just let it happen. Mrs. Reynolds turned to the principal, her voice desperate but low. "You have to stop this." But the principal only shook his head. It's too late. She had lost control. There was no other choice. The judges turned back to their microphones. And the lead judge, one of Mrs. Reynolds' longtime allies, spoke into the microphone. "This year's winner of the Westwood Talent Competition is..." A deep breath, a moment where everything hung in balance. "Jordan Carter." The room erupted again. But Jordan? He just nodded, a quiet understanding settling in. The award wasn't the victory. The victory was that they had been forced to acknowledge him at all. Brandon didn't stay for the end of the ceremony. As soon as the announcement was made, he slipped out the back of the auditorium, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. No taunts, no sarcastic remarks, no final attempt at a comeback. Because he understood now, this wasn't about one competition. It was about a shift in power. And for the first time, he was on the losing side. The next morning, Mrs. Reynolds walked into class, her usual confidence noticeably absent. The students watched her differently now. Not with fear, Not with respect, but with something else. Something sharp and unforgiving. Doubt. She stood in front of the room, staring at the faces looking back at her. For the first time in years, she had no control over what happened next. Jordan didn't need her approval anymore. He never had. He had proven what he needed to prove. But he also knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The atmosphere in the school had shifted. The moment Jordan walked into the hallways the next morning, he could feel it. The whispers, the stolen glances, the quiet acknowledgement from students who once ignored him. It wasn't just about his victory anymore. It was about what it represented. For the first time, students began questioning things they had always accepted as normal. For the first time, the silence had been broken. Brandon sat at his usual table in the cafeteria, staring at his untouched tray of food. His friends were still there, but they weren't laughing like they used to. Everything felt different now. He clenched his fists. He had always been at the top. He was supposed to win. Jordan wasn't supposed to matter. And yet, here they were. When Jordan passed by, Brandon spoke without looking up. "Don't think you've won anything," he muttered. "The system will always be bigger than you." Jordan stopped, tilting his head slightly, studying him. Then, without a word, he walked away. And somehow, that silence was more powerful than anything he could have said. Not all the teachers stood by Mrs. Reynolds anymore. Some of the younger faculty members had started to push back. Subtly at first. Mr. Davis, the music teacher, had already spoken out once. Now, he pushed even further, suggesting an overhaul in how students were evaluated in artistic fields. "We need a fairer system," he said in a staff meeting. "One that isn't built to favor the same students year after year." A few teachers nodded in agreement. But the older, more entrenched faculty, including the principal, remained silent. Then, after a moment, the principal spoke. "We can't let one incident dictate the way we run this institution," he said, voice measured but firm. Mrs. Reynolds folded her arms, her eyes cold. She wasn't going to let her authority crumble over one student. A private meeting took place that afternoon. Mrs. Reynolds sat across from the principal and a handful of senior teachers. Her expression unreadable. "This situation is dangerous," she said. "It sets a precedent." The principal nodded. "We need to contain this before it spreads." They laid out a plan. They would create new rules. Ones designed to quietly suppress students like Jordan. They would control the narrative, ensuring that his victory didn't gain too much attention. They would reach out to parents, subtly reinforcing the idea that the school's traditions needed to be protected. It was a familiar strategy, one that had worked for decades. They didn't realize that this time, things were different. For the first time in Westwood's history, students weren't backing down. Tyler and Madison had started gathering names, speaking to students who had been overlooked, ignored, or unfairly dismissed. A petition began circulating. At first, it was just a handful of names. Then a dozen, then 20, then 50. The demands were clear. A transparent grading system, equal opportunities in extracurricular activities, an end to the unwritten rules that held some students back while pushing others forward. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, something that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Reynolds watched from the teacher's lounge window as a group of students gathered in the courtyard. Whispering, organizing, her fingers tightened around the coffee cup in her hand. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Jordan sat in the chair across from Mrs. Reynolds, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. The blinds were half closed, casting slanted shadows across the room. This office had always felt suffocating to him, a place where authority loomed large, where decisions were made behind closed doors to protect those in power. But this time, it felt different. Mrs. Reynolds no longer had that smug confidence, that quiet assurance that she was in control. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp, something unsettled. She finally broke the silence. "So, you think you've won?" Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat or glance away. "I don't need to win," he said simply. "I just needed them to hear me." Mrs. Reynolds exhaled, shaking her head as if the weight of the past few weeks had finally settled on her shoulders. "People like you," she murmured, Her voice laced with something he couldn't quite place: frustration, resignation, maybe even a hint of fear. You always think you can change things. But this world doesn't change as easily as you think. Jordan tilted his head slightly. Maybe not, he admitted, but it already has. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, she gave a small, bitter smile. We'll see how far you get with that. Jordan didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Brandon walked through the halls of Westwood High with his head down. His usual arrogance stripped away. People still acknowledged him, still spoke to him, but something had shifted. The respect wasn't automatic anymore. He passed Jordan at the lockers. There was a moment, just a second, where it seemed like he might say something. But he didn't. Instead, he just nodded, a barely perceptible gesture, before walking away. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. A silent acknowledgement that the rules had changed. That the old way of things wasn't as unshakable as it once seemed. Jordan stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, where Tyler and Madison were waiting for him near the front steps. Tyler smirked. So, how'd it go? Jordan let out a breath, his gaze drifting past them, past the parking lot, past the school, to something further. She's not done yet, he admitted. Neither is the system. Madison crossed her arms. No one expected this to be over in one day, she said. Jordan nodded, because he knew she was right. This was just the beginning. The school hadn't changed overnight. There were still rules designed to keep people like him down. There were still teachers who looked the other way, students who refused to see what was right in front of them. But something had cracked, and cracks had a way of spreading. Jordan never needed to be a hero. He didn't need his name in headlines or people chanting for him. But what he had needed, what he had fought for, was recognition. Not admiration, not approval, just the simple, undeniable truth that he existed, that he couldn't be ignored. And now, he wasn't. For the first time, they had to see him. And once you saw the truth, you couldn't unsee it. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. In a world where power is built on silence, sometimes the bravest act is to make them hear you. Jordan didn't need their approval, he needed them to recognize the truth. And once the truth is seen, it cannot be ignored. But here's the question. How many others are still fighting? Waiting for their moment to be heard? What do you think? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where the system tried to silence someone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more eye-opening stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths, because the truth always finds a way out.